They set me up with a widow twice my age to embarrass me. I asked her to dance instead. My brothers were laughing in the corner, phones out, waiting for me to bolt. Eleanor's hands were shaking when I took them. What none of them knew was that the woman they brought to humiliate me was about to change everything and ruin them. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy stories like this one, please take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's get back into it. Let me take you back 2 years, to the August evening of my brother Marcus's engagement party at the Halston Country Club, because that was the night I stopped being the family joke and started becoming the family problem. I was 26. I worked as a junior architect at a mid-sized firm downtown. I drove a used Honda. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner. By every measurable standard in the Whitaker household, I was a disappointment. My three older brothers were a contractor, a commercial real estate broker, and a personal injury lawyer, in that order, and they each made more money in a quarter than I made in a year. My father reminded me of this often. My mother reminded me of it by never reminding me of anything else. That night, I wore a navy suit my mother had picked out for me the week before because she said the gray one made me look like I was applying for a job. I drove the 40 minutes to the country club with the windows down and the radio off, trying to talk myself into being charming. I knew the family would be in full performance mode. Marcus had landed a fiancée named Claire, who came from money and laughed at all of my father's jokes, and the engagement party was less about her and more about my father showing the rest of his golf league that his sons had turned out the way he'd planned. I parked in the overflow lot and walked up the stone path to the patio. String lights were already on, even though the sun hadn't fully gone down. A quartet was set up under the awning, playing something soft I didn't recognize. There were maybe 60 people, most of them my father's age, holding champagne flutes and laughing too loud. I saw my brothers before they saw me. They were standing together near the bar, the way they always did, like a wall I had to walk around to get to anything. Marcus spotted me first. He elbowed Devin, and Devin elbowed Cole, and all three of them turned at once with the kind of grin I had learned to be afraid of when I was 9 years old. "There he is," Marcus said, loud enough for the people around them to hear. "The man of the evening? Almost." "Almost," Cole repeated, and they laughed. I should have turned around right then. I knew that grin. I had seen that grin the time they convinced me there was a snake in my bed when I was 12. I had seen it the time they told my prom date I'd been arrested for shoplifting. I had seen it last Thanksgiving when Cole made a toast to the only Whitaker who'll never own a boat. But I kept walking because the alternative was driving back home and explaining to my mother why I'd ruined Marcus's night, and I was tired in a way I didn't know how to name yet. Marcus put his arm around my shoulder when I reached the bar. He smelled like bourbon and cologne. He told me they had a surprise for me. He said it the way you'd say it to a child. He said they'd been talking, and they'd decided it was about time I stopped being alone, and so they'd taken the liberty of arranging a date for me for the evening. I told him I didn't want a date. I told him I just wanted to get through the night. He squeezed my shoulder. He told me it was too late. He told me she was already here. He turned me around by the shoulders, and that was when I saw her. She was standing about 10 feet away, near the edge of the patio, holding a small clutch with both hands the way you hold something that might break. She was wearing a dark green dress that didn't quite fit her right, like she'd borrowed it from someone with different measurements. Her hair was gray at the temples, pinned back simply. She wasn't wearing much makeup. She was looking at the ground. She was easily in her early 50s. The patio had gone quiet in a circle around us. My brothers had their phones out low at their sides, recording. My father was standing by one of the heaters, watching with his arms crossed and the smallest smile I'd ever seen on him. My mother was looking at the canapes like they required her full attention. Marcus said loud, "Honey, come meet your date." The woman lifted her head. Her eyes met mine, and I saw the exact moment she understood that this was not what she'd been told it would be. Her face didn't crumble. She didn't run. She just absorbed it, the way a person absorbs a slap they've been expecting their whole life. Then she walked over, because she was the kind of person who would not make a scene even while one was being made of her. She held out her hand. She said her name was Eleanor. I heard Devin snort behind me. I heard Cole whisper something that ended in the word grandma. I heard one of my father's friends laugh into his glass. And something inside me, something that had been bent for 26 years, finally went quiet. I didn't take her hand. I offered her my arm instead. I asked her if she'd like to dance. The quartet was playing something slow. The patio went silent. Marcus's mouth opened and didn't close. Eleanor looked at me like she didn't understand the question. I asked her again. Softer, she took my arm. We walked past my brothers, past my father, past my mother, who had finally looked up, and out onto the small square of polished wood the club used as a dance floor. I put one hand at her waist light, the way you'd hold something you'd been entrusted with. She put her hand on my shoulder. Her palm was shaking against the fabric of my suit. We danced. I didn't look at my family. I looked at her because she deserved to be looked at by someone that night, and because I had decided, somewhere between her name and the first step, that I was going to be the someone. When the song ended, she whispered that they'd paid her $200 to come. She whispered that they'd told her it was a real date with a young man who was shy. She whispered that she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I walked her to her car. It was an old gray sedan parked at the far end of the lot, away from the valet. I asked her if I could take her to a real dinner, somewhere quiet, some night that week. I told her she could say no and I would understand. She didn't say no. She gave me her number on the back of her receipt, and she drove away, and I stood in the parking lot with my hands in my pockets, and the laughter of my family drifting out across the lawn behind me, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the one being laughed at. I was the one who'd stopped listening. I called her on Tuesday. I'd waited 2 days, not because I was playing a game, but because I wanted her to have time to say no if she wanted to. She didn't say no. She answered on the third ring, and her voice was careful, like she expected me to tell her the whole thing had been a joke after all. I asked her where she wanted to eat. She paused for a long time. She said there was a place on Vernon Street called Peppino's, an Italian place, and she liked their bread. I told her I'd pick her up at 7. She said she'd rather meet me there. I understood. I told her I'd see her at 7. Peppino's was the kind of place with vinyl tablecloths and a chalkboard menu and a man at the register who looked like he'd been there since the building was built. There were 6 tables. 3 of them were empty. I got there 10 minutes early and sat by the window so she'd see me when she came in. She came in at 7 on the dot. She was wearing a black sweater and jeans, and her hair was down. She looked younger than she had on the patio, which is to say she looked like herself instead of like someone wearing a costume someone else had picked out. I stood up when she came to the table. She seemed surprised by that. I pulled her chair out. She seemed surprised by that too, we ordered. She got the lasagna. I got the same thing because I couldn't focus on the menu. The waiter brought bread and oil, and Eleanor tore a piece in half and held it without eating it for a long minute. She said she wanted to tell me some things before we went any further. She said she wanted me to know what she was, so I could decide what I wanted to do. I told her okay. She told me her husband's name had been David. She told me he had been a high school history teacher for 23 years. She told me he had a heart attack on a Saturday morning 3 years ago, sitting at the kitchen table doing the crossword, and that he was 49 years old. She told me she had been the one to find him. She told me they had wanted children and it hadn't happened, and they had decided, somewhere around year 15, to stop wanting it and just love each other instead. She told me she worked 2 jobs now. She did 3 12-hour shifts a week as a hospice aide at a place called Briarwood. The rest of the week, she worked at a flower shop on Maple Avenue owned by a woman named Rosa. She made enough to pay her bills and not much else. She still lived in the house she and David had bought when they got married, because selling it felt like throwing him away. She told me she had taken the $200 from my brother because her car needed a new alternator and she had been putting it off for a month. She told me Marcus had told her over the phone that I was a shy young professional who hated big family events and that his mother had asked him to find someone kind to keep me company at the engagement party. She told me she had believed him because she wanted to believe him. She said all of this without crying. She said it the way you read a list out loud. I told her my brothers were not kind. I told her my family was not what they pretended to be on the patio. I told her I had spent 26 years being the punchline of a joke that I was only just starting to understand the shape of. She asked me why I had asked her to dance. I thought about it for a while. The bread sat between us getting cold. I told her I had asked her to dance because she had not deserved what they did, and because I had not wanted to be the kind of man who let it happen, and because once I had seen her face, I had not been able to see anything else. In the room, she put the piece of bread down, her eyes filled just once, and she pressed the corner of her napkin against them and kept it there for a moment, and when she lowered the napkin, she was steady again. I didn't reach across the table. I didn't say anything clever. I passed her the basket of bread and told her to try the rosemary one. She laughed, just a small one, and we ate. She told me over the lasagna that she had wanted to be a landscape architect once. She had been one semester away from her degree when her mother got sick and she had to come home and never went back. She told me about the gardens she had designed in her head over the years, the ones she would never build. I told her I designed buildings for a living. She said she knew. She said Marcus had told her that part at least, and it had been the only thing about me he'd gotten right. We talked for 2 hours. I learned that she liked black coffee and hated cilantro and read 3 books a week from the library because she couldn't afford to buy them. She learned that I'd grown up the youngest of 4 boys and that I had a scar on my left eyebrow from when Cole pushed me off a dock when I was 8. She didn't laugh when I told her that. She just looked at me for a second longer than she needed to. I paid the bill. She tried to split it, and I told her gently that I had asked her to dinner and I would pay for it. And the next time, if there was a next time, she could pay if she wanted. She said there could be a next time. I drove her to her car in the lot behind the restaurant. She had parked under a streetlight. I walked her to the driver's side door, and she turned around to face me, and we stood there for a moment, neither of us quite sure what came next. I took her hand, I lifted it, I kissed the back of her knuckles once, the way my grandfather used to kiss my grandmother's hand when he came home from work. Eleanor's eyes did something I won't try to describe, because I'm not good at that kind of writing. She squeezed my fingers and let go and got in her car and drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a minute after her taillights turned the corner. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was the feeling of looking forward to a phone call. I walked back to my Honda. I had parked 1 row over, near the dumpsters, because the lot had been full when I arrived. There was a car I recognized parked across the street, lights off, engine running. It was Marcus's black Escalade. He was in the driver's seat. He saw me see him. He didn't drive away. He just lifted his phone, and I saw the small red light of the camera. And I understood that whatever I had just had with Eleanor was not going to stay between the two of us. Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the story so far. If you are, go ahead and drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel out. All right, back to the video. The first text came in at 6:40 the next morning. It was from Devin. It was a screenshot of a video. Paused on the moment I kissed Eleanor's hand in the parking lot. The caption underneath in the family group chat said, "Update, he's serious." I sat up in bed and watched the chat fill up in real time. Cole sent 3 laughing faces. Marcus sent a longer message saying I was making a fool of myself and that the whole country club had been talking about me since Saturday. My father typed for almost a full minute before sending one sentence, which read, "Call me when you wake up." My mother didn't type anything. She just left the chat, which she had never done before, and which somehow felt worse than anything the others had said. I put the phone face down on the nightstand and got in the shower. I stood under the water for a long time. I thought about Eleanor on the other side of town, probably getting ready for a hospice shift, and I thought about the small red light of Marcus's camera, and I thought about how my father had typed for a full minute and only managed one sentence. I called him from my kitchen, holding a coffee I wasn't drinking. He picked up on the first ring. He didn't say hello. He said, "Come to the house. 6 o'clock your mother is making dinner." I told him I was busy. He said 6 o'clock and hung up. I went to work. I sat at my desk and tried to draft a stair detail for the commission I was on and couldn't get the rise and run to add up. At 11, my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. It said, "Thank you for last night. I had a nice time." I read it 4 times. I wrote back, "Me too." "Are you free Friday?" She wrote, "Yes." I put the phone face down on my desk and got back to work, and the stair detail came together in 20 minutes. I drove to my parents' house at 6. The house I grew up in is a 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac off Old Mill Road, with white shutters and a brass knocker and a lawn. My father pays a surface $200 a month to keep mowed exactly the way he likes it. I parked behind my mother's Lexus and walked up the brick path and let myself in without ringing the bell, the way I had done for 26 years. The whole family was there, Marcus and Devin and Cole, sitting at the dining room table. Claire, Marcus's fiancée, sitting beside him with her hands folded in her lap and the careful look of someone who knew this was not her fight. My mother was at the head of the table, not eating. My father was at the foot, eating slowly, the way he always did when he was angry. There was a place set for me. There was no place set for Eleanor because they hadn't told me to bring her. And because we both already knew she wasn't the point, I sat down. My father waited until I had unfolded my napkin. Then he asked me what I thought I was doing. I told him I was eating dinner. He told me not to be cute. He told me he had spent 26 years building a name in this town. He told me that name was the only reason any of his sons had the lives they had. He told me that my mother had cried on Sunday morning because 3 different people from her church group had asked her gently whether I was all right. He told me he had been at the club Monday for lunch and a man he had known for 30 years had asked him, with a straight face, whether I was being taken advantage of by an older woman with money problems. He told me he understood the joke had gotten out of hand. He told me that was on Marcus, and Marcus had been spoken to. He told me he was willing to forgive the situation entirely and let me move on with my life. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded check. He pushed it across the table toward me. He didn't say what it was for. He didn't have to. I looked at the check. I didn't pick it up. I looked at my brothers. Marcus was watching me with the kind of expression a person gets when they've already decided how something is going to end. Devin was looking at his plate. Cole was smirking. I looked at my mother. She wasn't looking at any of us. I folded my napkin. I set it on the table next to my untouched plate. I stood up. I told my father I wasn't going to take the check. I told him I was going to keep seeing Eleanor. I told him I was sorry if that embarrassed him, but I had spent 26 years being embarrassed by him, and I had survived it. And he would survive this. My father stood up too. He told me that if I walked out of the house that night without taking the check, I should not bother coming back for Sunday dinner. He told me I should not bother coming back for Christmas. He told me I should not bother calling my mother because she would not be answering. I looked at my mother again. She did not look up. I walked out. I drove to Eleanor's flower shop. It was almost 8, but the light was still on in the back. I parked on the street and walked up and knocked on the glass door. She came out from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw me and unlocked the door without asking why I was there. I had brought takeout from a Thai place near my office because I had thought about her on the drive over and I had remembered she'd mentioned in passing that she hadn't eaten dinner. She let me in. She locked the door behind us. We sat on 2 overturned plastic crates in the back room, surrounded by buckets of white lilies and stargazer arrangements waiting to be delivered in the morning. I told her, between bites of pad see-ew, what had happened at my parents' house. I told her everything. She put her container down. She looked at me with her eyes wet for the second time in 3 days, and she said she was so sorry she had done this to my family. I told her she hadn't done anything to my family. I told her my family had been broken before she ever walked onto that patio. She had just been the thing that made it visible. She didn't say anything to that. She just reached across the small space between the crates and put her hand on the side of my face. Her palm was cool and smelled faintly of cut stems and water. I leaned forward and kissed her. She kissed me back. It was not a long kiss, and it was not a complicated one. And there were lilies all around us, and somewhere a refrigerator was humming. And that was the first time I knew, all the way down, that I was not going to walk away from her no matter what my father put on the table. The weeks after that night moved in a rhythm I had never had before. I'd leave my office at 6 and drive across town to the flower shop and help Eleanor close up. I learned how to strip thorns off roses without bleeding. I learned which buckets needed fresh water in the morning and which arrangements were going out for funerals and which were going out for weddings, and how she could tell the difference at a glance just from the order forms Rosa left clipped to the cooler. On nights when she had a hospice shift, I'd pick her up at 11 outside the Briarwood entrance because the staff lot was poorly lit, and she'd told me once that she hated the walk to her car after a hard night. She didn't ask me to come. I just started showing up, and after the 3rd time, she stopped pretending to be surprised. She lived in a small 2-bedroom on Linden Street, a brick house with a sagging front porch and a backyard that had once been a garden and was now mostly weeds. She told me the first time I came over that David had been the gardener. After he died, she hadn't been able to make herself go out there. The tools were still in the shed where he'd left them. She had been paying a kid down the street $20 a month to mow the front lawn, and she didn't go around to the back at all. I asked her if I could see it. She walked me out through the kitchen door. The backyard was maybe 40 feet deep, fenced in on 3 sides, with 2 raised beds collapsing on themselves and a brick path almost completely overgrown. There was an old wooden bench against the back fence. She told me David had built it the first spring they lived there. I told her on a Saturday in September that I was going to fix the beds for her if she'd let me. Not the whole garden, just the beds. She could decide what to plant. I'd bring the lumber and the soil. She watched me for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay." I spent 3 weekends on those beds. She came out with coffee in the mornings and lemonade in the afternoons. She didn't help with the building, but she sat on David's bench with a book in her lap and watched. And sometimes she'd read me a sentence out loud if it was a good one. By the end of the third weekend, the beds were standing square and level, lined with fresh cedar, full of soil that smelled like a different kind of life. She planted dahlias. She told me they had been her mother's favorite. We had a routine on Sunday mornings. I'd come over around 9. She'd already have made coffee. We'd sit at her kitchen table, which was small and round and pushed up against a window that looked out onto the new beds, and I'd sketch garden layouts on graph paper while she read the obituaries out loud. She read the obituaries every Sunday. She told me she had started doing it after David died because she wanted to know who else had been lost that week and because some of them deserved to be read by someone who didn't know them. I started speaking up at work. It was small at first. In a Tuesday design meeting in late September, I disagreed with my senior partner, Henry, about a curtain wall detail on the Riverside Commission. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. I held my ground. I had numbers. I had the energy modeling. I had a sketch I'd done at Eleanor's kitchen table the Sunday before. Henry took the sketch home with him that night, and on Thursday he told me I was leading the curtain wall package. In October, the firm landed a small civic building, a branch library out in Greene County, and Henry gave it to me. My first project lead, I called Eleanor from the parking garage. She was on shift and she stepped outside to take it, and I could hear the wind on her end and the gravel under her shoes. And she told me she was proud of me in a voice that didn't need to say more than that. She fell asleep on my couch one Friday night in early November. We had been watching a movie I'd already seen, and she'd already seen, which was the only kind of movie we could agree on. Her head ended up on my shoulder around the 40-minute mark. I didn't move. I didn't change positions. I let my arm fall asleep, and I let the movie end, and I let the menu screen loop for an hour and a half until she woke up on her own, and she was embarrassed, and I told her she didn't need to be. I drove her home at 1 in the morning. At her front door, she looked at me for a long time before she went inside. She didn't ask me to stay. I didn't ask either. We weren't there yet, and we both knew it. And there was something good about not being there yet. The Briarwood patient was named Margaret. Eleanor mentioned her for the first time in late October. Margaret was 83. She had been a high school English teacher for 41 years and a widow for 20 of them, and she had no children. She had been at Briarwood for 6 months. Most of the aides found her difficult because she was sharp and she knew she was dying and she didn't pretend to be at peace with it. Eleanor liked her. Eleanor, said Margaret, reminded her of her own mother, only meaner. I met her on a Saturday afternoon in November. Eleanor's regular aide had called out sick and Eleanor had agreed to cover an extra shift. And I'd come along to keep her company in the break room. Margaret asked, through the open door of her room, who the young man in the hallway was. Eleanor brought me in. Margaret looked me up and down from her hospital bed. Then she looked at Eleanor. Then she said, well, finally, she made us sit. She made me read her 3 pages of a Wendell Berry novel she'd been working through. She made Eleanor laugh twice, real laughs, the kind I'd only heard a handful of times. When we left, she told Eleanor we were her favorite young couple, which was funny because Eleanor was 52 and I was 26. Eleanor didn't correct her. She just kissed Margaret's papery forehead and told her we'd be back Tuesday. We went back Tuesday. We went back the Saturday after that. Margaret started saving things for us, small things, a sentence she wanted me to read, a poem she wanted Eleanor to memorize, an opinion about the weather. 3 weeks before Christmas, on a Saturday afternoon when she was sharper than she'd been in days, Margaret asked me to lean down close to the bed. She put a sealed white envelope into my hand. It was heavy. There was something inside it that wasn't just paper. She closed my fingers around it. She told me to put it in my coat pocket and not to open it. She told me to keep it somewhere safe. She told me, when the time comes, you'll know. She squeezed my hand once, hard for an old woman, and let go. The envelope sat in the top drawer of my dresser for 2 weeks before everything came apart. I didn't open it. Margaret had asked me not to, and I wasn't going to break that for the sake of curiosity. Eleanor knew it was there. We had both agreed to leave it alone until Margaret told us otherwise. The gala was on a Friday night in early December. It was the annual fundraiser for the City Architecture Foundation, held in the ballroom of the Halston Hotel downtown. My firm bought a table every year. Henry had asked me the week before if I was bringing anyone. I told him yes. He didn't ask who. I told him anyway. He nodded once and said, "Good. I bought Eleanor a dress." She tried to refuse. I told her that I had asked her to a work event, and that meant the dress came with the invitation. She let me drive her to a boutique on Sherwood Avenue on a Wednesday night, and she stood in front of a three-way mirror in a navy blue dress that fit her properly for the first time in 3 years. And she looked at herself for a long time before she nodded at the saleswoman. She wore her hair up the night of the gala. She wore a small pair of pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's. When I picked her up at her house, she came out the front door and down the walk, and I forgot for a moment how to open the passenger door. The ballroom was full when we got there. White linens, candles, the firm's table in the second row near the stage. Henry stood up when I brought Eleanor over. He took her hand. He told her he had heard a lot about her. She told him she had heard a lot about him, too. He pulled her chair out himself. The other partners' wives smiled at her, the way wives smile at someone they have decided to like before they have decided why. The cocktail hour was easy. The dinner started. The salad course had just been cleared when I heard Marcus's voice behind me. I turned around. All three of them were standing there. Marcus in a tuxedo, Devin in a suit, Cole in a blazer he had clearly bought that afternoon. Behind them was a young woman I didn't recognize. She was 24, maybe 25, blonde in a red dress, holding a clutch the same way Eleanor had held hers at the country club 4 months earlier. Marcus had a glass of champagne in his hand. He was smiling, he said, loud enough for the next two tables to hear, "Brother, we thought we should swing by. We brought someone we wanted you to meet. Her name is Brittany. She's a real estate agent. She's 24. She has a pulse." The conversation at our table stopped. The young woman, Brittany, had the decency to look uncomfortable. She also did not leave. Marcus stepped closer. He looked at Eleanor for the first time. He looked her up and down the way you look at a price tag in a store you don't belong. He said, "Eleanor, nice dress. Did he buy that for you? Or did you put it on the credit card you can't pay off?" The table went still. He said, "Tell me honestly, is it the money? Because we can do the math out loud if you want. He doesn't have any. So is it the youth? Because that runs out. Is it the respectability? Because a young architect on your arm is a lot more respectable than working two jobs at 52 and renting flowers to widows like yourself." He was loud. People at the next table had turned around. Henry was watching with his jaws set in a way I'd never seen before. Eleanor put her napkin on the table. She picked up her clutch. She started to stand. She had that same look on her face she'd had on the patio in August. The look of a person absorbing something she had been expecting her whole life. I put my hand on her arm. "Not hard, just enough," I said. "Stay." She stayed. I stood up. I turned to face Marcus. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was already quiet because the room had already understood, the way rooms do, that something was happening. I said, "I want to tell you 3 things about this woman," I said. "The first thing is that in the 4 months I have known her, she has not once asked me for money, not for gas, not for groceries, not for the alternator on her car, which she paid for herself by working a double shift at a hospice the week she met me. None of you have ever gone 4 months without asking our father for something," I said. "The second thing is that she sat at her kitchen table with me every Sunday morning for 2 months and listened to me talk about a curtain wall. Detail none of you would understand if I drew it for you in crayon. None of you have ever asked me what I do for a living. Not one of you knows the name of the building I am working on right now." I said, "The third thing is that she is the only person in my life, including the people who raised me, who has ever made me feel like the man I might become is worth more than the boy you all decided I was." I said, "So no, Marcus, it is not the money, it is not the youth, it is not the respectability, it is that she sees me. And the reason that bothers you so much is that none of you ever bothered to look." I sat down. The room stayed quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Henry started clapping, slow at first. Then the wife of the managing partner picked it up. Then most of the table. Then, somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a man I had never seen before stood up and clapped too. Brittany, the young woman in the red dress, looked at Marcus. She looked at the floor. She looked at the door. She walked to the door, alone and out of it, and I never saw her again. My father, who I had not noticed at the foundation board's head table at the front of the room, stood up from his seat. He did not look at me. He walked out of the ballroom without a word. My mother stood too. She did not walk out. She turned in her chair and she looked at me across 30 feet of candlelight, And for the first time in 26 years, she looked at me like she was seeing the person who had been sitting across from her at the kitchen table. All those years, Marcus and Devin and Cole left. The dinner went on. In the cab home that night, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. She held my hand on the seat between us. We were almost at her house when she turned her face toward mine in the dark of the back seat and whispered, "I think I love you." I didn't make her wait for it. I told her, "I've known for a month." She started crying, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't ask to be comforted. I put my arm around her shoulders and she put her head against my chest, and the cab driver, who had been very polite the whole ride, pretended not to see us in the rear. Margaret died on a Wednesday morning in January, 2 days after the first recent snow of the winter. Eleanor called me from the Briarwood parking lot. She had just come off shift. She told me Margaret had gone in her sleep sometime between 3 and 5. She told me the night nurse had found her at the 5 o'clock check. She told me Margaret had looked peaceful, which was the word everyone used in that building and which was sometimes even true. I left work. I drove to Briarwood and picked her up and took her back to her house. She didn't cry on the drive. She cried at the kitchen sink, washing a coffee cup that was already clean. I stood behind her and put my arms around her, and she leaned back against my chest and let me hold her. Up for a while. Then she dried her hands and made us both tea, and we sat at the table, and she told me stories about Margaret I hadn't heard yet. The memorial was the following Saturday at a small Methodist chapel out in the county. Margaret had outlived most of the people who would have come to mourn her. There were maybe 15 of us, 2 former students, 3 retired teachers, a handful of Briarwood staff, Eleanor and me, a thin man in a gray suit who I didn't recognize. After the service, the thin man came over to us in the chapel vestibule. He introduced himself as William Pace. He said he was Margaret's attorney. He had been her attorney for 26 years. He asked if he could speak with us privately for a few minutes. He took us into a small side room off the chapel. He set his briefcase on a folding table. He opened it. He took out a manila folder. He told us that Margaret had updated her will 14 months ago. He told us that she had been very specific about her instructions. He told me that she had named me by my full name as the beneficiary of a particular asset, and that he was authorized to release the documentation to me today. He took out a deed. He slid it across the table. He told me that Margaret had owned, since 1981, a 40-acre parcel of lakefront property on the north shore of Lake Tannehill, about an hour outside the city. He told me her late husband had bought it the year they got married, and they had spent 40 summers there in a small cabin that was no longer standing. He told me she had been offered 7 figures for it twice in the last decade and had refused both times. He told me the parcel was now mine. There were no liens, there were no conditions, the taxes were paid through the end of the year. There was a separate envelope in the folder sealed that Margaret had asked him to give me when the deed changed hands. I held the envelope in one hand, I held the deed in the other. Eleanor was sitting beside me with her hand over her mouth. William Pace closed his briefcase. He told us to take our time. He left the room. I opened the envelope. It was a single page, in Margaret's handwriting, which was shakier than it had been in the books she'd loaned me, but still clear. She had written, "To the young man who reads aloud and pulls out chairs and looks at the woman he loves the way every woman should be looked at once in her life. I watched you for 3 months. I am old enough to know what I am looking at. The land is yours. Build something on it. Build it for her. Build it slow. Do not let anyone tell you that the love that surprises you is worth less than the love that flatters you. The opposite is true, and the years prove it. Yours with affection, Margaret Hollander." I read it twice, then I handed it to Eleanor. She read it once and folded it carefully along the original creases and pressed it flat against her chest with both hands. We drove out to the land that afternoon. Neither of us suggested waiting. The sky had cleared after the morning service. The roads out to the lake were salted and empty. We turned onto a gravel road off the county highway. We drove for almost a mile through bare oaks and pines. The road ended at a clearing on a low rise above the water. The lake was frozen at the edges, dark in the middle, maybe a half-mile across. There was no house. There were the rough stones of an old foundation where the cabin had been, half buried in leaves. There were 2 enormous sugar maples flanking what must have been the front door, 80 years old at least, their bare branches reaching over the foundation like a roof that wasn't there anymore. We walked the property as the sun started to drop. There was a dock at the bottom of the hill, the piling still sound, the boards needing replacement. There was a path through the woods toward the south end of the parcel. There was a flat shelf of land just east of the old foundation that would catch the morning sun and the lake view at the same time. I stood on the shelf with Eleanor. We watched the sun go down over the far shore. It took about 10 minutes. We didn't talk for most of it. When the light was almost gone, I turned to face her. I didn't have a ring. I hadn't planned this. I had not even known an hour ago that this place existed. I took both of her hands. I told her I wanted to marry her. I told her I wanted to build a house on this shelf of land with her and grow old in it with her, and that I had known I wanted it since the night in the back of the flower shop, and I had been waiting for a moment that felt right, and Margaret had given me one. I told her she could say no. I told her she could ask me to wait. I told her I would understand either answer. Eleanor looked at me for a long time. Her hands were cold in mine. Her eyes were full, but she was not crying. She said yes. Then she said, "Are you sure?" I told her I was. She said, "I can't give you children. You know that. You're 26. You should have children if you want them." I had thought about this. I had thought about it many times. I had been thinking about it since the night at Pepino's when she told me about her and David trying for 15 years. I told her, "I'm not marrying you for what you can give me. I'm marrying you for what you already are." She put her forehead against mine. We stood like that for a while. The wind off the lake was cold, but it didn't seem to matter. When we finally drove back to her house that night, she put Margaret's letter in a small wooden box on her bedroom dresser, the box where she kept David's wedding ring and her mother's locket, and she closed the lid carefully. I stayed with her that night. I slept on her couch because we had agreed, without ever saying it, that we were going to do the rest of this the slow way Margaret had told us to. But I stayed. I told my family in February. I didn't do it at a dinner. I didn't do it at the house. I did it the way I should have been doing things for years, which was on my own terms, on my own schedule, without sitting down at a table I hadn't been invited to. I sent 4 text messages, one to each of them. The message was the same. It said I was engaged. It said the wedding would be in the spring. It says I was sending the message because they deserved to hear it from me before. They heard it from anyone else, and not because I expected them to come. My father called within 90 seconds. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't listen to it that night. I listened to it the next morning, and it was the kind of message I had expected, and I deleted it without writing it down. Marcus didn't call. Marcus did something worse. I found out about the private investigator 3 weeks later. His name was Edgar Lemoyne. He was 61 years old. He had been doing surveillance work in the county for 34 years. Marcus had hired him in late February with a budget of $5,000 and one instruction, which was to find something on Eleanor that I could not ignore. I know all of this because Edgar Lemoyne came to find me himself. He showed up at my office on a Thursday afternoon in early March. He gave the receptionist a name that wasn't his and asked to speak with me about a residential project. I came out to the lobby. He was a heavy man in a brown overcoat with a folder under his arm. He asked if there was somewhere we could talk privately. I took him to the small conference room behind reception. He set the folder on the table. He didn't open it. He told me who he was. He told me who had hired him. He told me he had spent 6 weeks on Eleanor. He had pulled her credit history. He had run her through 3 databases. He had talked to 2 former neighbors and her old supervisor at a job she'd held in her 30s. He had sat outside her flower shop for 2 full days. He had followed her on a Sunday afternoon to a cemetery 30 miles outside the city, where she had spent an hour at the grave of a man named David Whitmore, leaving fresh dahlias she had brought with her in a paper-wrapped bundle. He told me he had found nothing. He told me he meant nothing in the literal sense. He told me her credit was clean. He told me the medical debt from her husband's death had been paid off in installments, on time every month for 2.5 years. He told me her 2 former neighbors had used the word kind, unprompted, both of them. He told me her old supervisor had cried on the phone when he asked about her. He told me he had been a private investigator for 34 years, and that, in his professional opinion, Eleanor was the cleanest person he had ever investigated. He told me he had come to see me because he was not going to take the second half of his payment from my brother. He told me he had been thinking about it for a week. He told me he had a daughter Eleanor's age. He told me he didn't always sleep well and that he had decided a long time ago that there were some jobs that made the sleeping worse and that this was one of them. He pushed the folder across the table. He told me it was the full file. He told me he was giving me the only copy. He told me what I did with it was my business, and that he was retiring at the end of the year anyway and didn't particularly care if Marcus came after him for breach of contract, because Marcus had paid him in cash and there wasn't anything in writing. He stood up, he buttoned his coat, he left. I sat in the conference room with the folder for a long time. I didn't open it, I knew what was in it. I put it in my briefcase and took it home and put it in a drawer with the other things I had been keeping. I will explain those other things in a minute. My mother came to the flower shop alone the following Saturday. Eleanor told me about it that night, on the phone in the careful voice she used when she was working something out. My mother had come in around 2 in the afternoon. She had asked Rosa at the counter if Eleanor was there. Rosa had pointed her to the back. My mother had stood in the doorway of the back room for almost a full minute before Eleanor noticed her. Eleanor told me they had talked for an hour and a half. My mother had cried twice. She had apologized for the patio in August. She had apologized for the dinner where my father offered the check. She had apologized for not standing up at the gala. She had apologized for not standing up for a great many things. She had told Eleanor that she did not expect to be forgiven, but that she wanted to be honest, and that the honest things was that she had been wrong, and that she was tired of being wrong, and that she would like, if Eleanor would have her, to come to the engagement dinner. Eleanor said yes. Eleanor had cried a little too. Then they had drunk lukewarm coffee from Rosa's pot, and Eleanor had walked my mother to her car. I called my mother that night. We talked for the first time in 7 months. We did not solve anything, but we talked, and she said my name twice during the call, and that was more than I had expected. The engagement dinner was the following Friday. It was small on purpose. Eleanor and me, my mother, Rosa, who had become a kind of aunt to Eleanor over the years, Henry from my firm and his wife, William Pace, Margaret's attorney, who had become something like an uncle to both of us in the months since the memorial. 8 people. A long table at a quiet restaurant called Heller's on the east side of the city, with private dining in the back room. We were almost through the appetizers when the door of the back room opened. My father was standing in it. He was not in a suit. He was in a sport coat over a wrinkled shirt. His hair was uncombed. He had been drinking. You could see it in his eyes before you smelled it on him, and you smelled it on him from across the room. He was holding the doorframe with one hand to keep himself steady. He looked at the table. He looked at my mother. He looked at me. He looked at Eleanor. He said, "I have something to say." The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something is about to happen, and everyone in it knows. Eleanor reached under the table and took my hand. She did not squeeze it. She just held it, palm down on my thigh, the way you hold something you are not going to let go of. My father stepped into the room. He let the door swing shut behind him. The waiter, who had been about to come in with the second course, turned around in the hallway and walked the other way without making eye contact with anyone. My father walked to the head of the table. He put both hands flat on the wood. He looked at Eleanor. He told her, in front of everyone, what he thought of her. I am not going to write down everything he said. I will tell you that he used 3 words I had never heard him use about a woman before. I will tell you he used the word desperate. I will tell you he used the word predatory. I will tell you he used the word leech twice. I will tell you he asked her to her face what it was like to know that the only reason a young man would touch her was because he was too broken to know any better. Rosa stood up. Henry stood up. My mother started to stand, and I shook my head at her, and she sat back down. I stood up. I told my father to sit down. He laughed at me. He told me I had no idea what I had done to this family. He told me he had spent 26 years building a name in this town, and I had handed it over to a flower shop widow in less than 6 months. He told me my mother had been crying every night for weeks. He told me Marcus's engagement had been called off 2 days ago, which I did not know yet, and that it was my fault. He told me Devon's wife had moved out, which I also did not know, and that it was my fault. He told me Cole was a mess, which was not new information. He told me everything that had ever been wrong with our family was now, somehow, my fault. I let him finish. I waited. I told him I had something to show him. I reached down to the chair beside me. I picked up the leather portfolio I had brought to dinner. I had not told Eleanor what was in it. I had told her only that I was bringing it and that she should not be afraid. I opened the portfolio on the table. I had spent 2 years documenting them. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I did not start out planning a revenge. I started out when I was 24, after the Thanksgiving where Cole made his toast about the boat, by writing down what people in my family said to me. I wrote it in a notebook I kept in my apartment. I wrote down what they said and when they said it and who else was there. I did it because my therapist at the time, a woman named Dr. Patel, who I saw for 6 months before I ran out of money, had told me it would help me understand whether I was being unreasonable or whether they were. I had been doing it for 2 years before I met Eleanor. After I met her, I started saving the rest of it, the text messages from the group chat, the voicemail my father had left the morning after the engagement party, the videos Marcus had posted to his close friend story on Instagram, which a cousin had screen recorded and sent to me without comment. The videos Devin had posted to his own account. The recording of the dinner where my father offered me the check because I had set my phone on the side table when I walked in and forgotten to turn off the voice memo I had started in the car. I had not been planning to use any of it for anything. I had been keeping it because keeping it made me feel less crazy. I laid it out on the table. I did not yell. I did not make a speech. I went through it the way I would have gone through a project file in a meeting at work. I read 3 text messages out loud. I read the one Marcus sent the morning after the engagement party. I read the one Devin sent during the gala while I was giving my speech, which said, "He really thinks he's something." I read the one my father had sent to all 3 of my brothers, and not to me, in the family group chat the day after my mother left it, which said, "Let him have his old whore. He was never going to amount to anything anyway." I let that one sit. My mother put her hand over her mouth. I took out my phone. I told the room I wanted to play one voicemail. I told them they did not have to listen if they did not want to. I told my mother specifically that she did not have to listen and that I would not be hurt if she stepped out. She stayed. I played the voicemail my father had left me the morning after I texted them about the engagement. It was 41 seconds long. He had not known it would be saved. He had not known anyone but me would ever hear it. He described Eleanor in terms I will not write down here. He used a word I had never heard him use about anyone. He said it twice. He said, near the end, that he hoped she would die before the wedding because it would save him from having to watch his son make the biggest mistake of his life. The voicemail ended. The room did not move. My father had gone very white. He was no longer holding the table. He was holding the back of the empty chair next to him. I closed the portfolio. I told him I was not going to use any of it in court. I told him I was not going to put it online. I told him I was not even going to keep it after tonight because I did not want to be the kind of man who kept things like that. I told him I had needed him to hear it out loud, in a room with witnesses, because for 26 years he had been able to say things to me in private and pretend in public that he was a different kind of man. I told him that was over. I told him I loved my mother. I told him I would be at the wedding. I told him he would not. I sat down. My mother stood up. She walked the length of the table to my father. She did not raise her voice. She told him, in a voice I had never heard her use, that he would be leaving the house tonight, and that he would not be sleeping there again until she decided otherwise, and that she was not sure she was going to decide otherwise. He looked at her for a long moment. He walked out. The waiter, who had been hovering at a polite distance, came back in with the second course like nothing had happened, because that was his job, and we ate slowly, and Eleanor held my hand under the table for the entire rest of the meal and never once let it go. The fallout happened slowly, and then all at once, Claire, Marcus's fiancée, had called off the engagement 2 days before the dinner. I learned why a week later. She had seen one of the videos Marcus had posted from the country club in August. Not the one of me dancing with Eleanor. The one he had filmed afterward in the parking lot of his 3 brothers laughing about what they had just done. He had captioned it with 2 words I will not repeat. Claire had not seen it until March, when one of her bridesmaids, who had been at the engagement party, finally showed it to her on her own phone because she could not stand to keep watching Claire plan a wedding with a man she did not really know. Claire had watched twice. Then she had taken off her ring and put it on the kitchen counter and gone to stay with her sister. She did not come back. I heard later from my mother that Claire's father, who was a partner at a law firm downtown, had been very thorough about the prenuptial considerations on the way out. Marcus did not lose anything he had earned, but he lost a great deal he had been planning on. Devin's wife, Sarah, had moved out the week after Christmas. I had not known. None of us had known, because Devin had told no one, and Sarah had been quiet about it for reasons that turned out to be her own. She had been at the gala in December. She had heard my speech. She had gone home that night and told Devin she was tired, and she had spent the next 3 weeks watching him The way a person watches something they are trying to decide about, and on January 2nd, she had taken their two daughters to her mother's house in Charlottesville and filed for separation on January 4th. She told my mother much later that the gala had not been the reason exactly. She told her it had been the moment she realized that the man she had married was the kind of man who would stand behind Marcus on a patio in August and not say a word. Cole came to the flower shop on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. Eleanor told me about it that night. She had been in the back room making a sympathy arrangement when the bell over the front door rang. She had come out wiping her hands. Cole had been standing in the middle of the shop with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the buckets of tulips like he had never seen a flower before. He had told her, without preamble, that he was sorry. He had told her he was 29 years old, and he had been a bad person for at least the last 10 of those years, and he was not sure he knew how to stop, but he wanted to try. He had told her he was not going to ask her to forgive him. He had told her he was going to ask her if she would let him come to the wedding, and that if she said no, he would understand. Eleanor had looked at him for a long time. She had told him that the wedding was not hers to gatekeep, but that she would talk to me. She had told me that night that she believed him. She told me she did not know why she believed him, only that she had spent enough years around dying people to know the difference between a person performing an apology and a person making one. She told me she thought Cole had been making one. I called Cole the next morning. I told him he could come to the wedding. I told him if he came, he would sit at the back and not give a toast and not stand for any photos with the family. I told him if he made it through the wedding without doing or saying anything that hurt Eleanor, I would have lunch with him the following week. He agreed to every condition. He did not push back on any of them. He thanked me. He said thank you 3 times in the conversation, which I had never heard him say in my life. Marcus and Devin did not call. Marcus, I heard, had stopped going to the country club. Devin, I heard, had moved out of the house he and Sarah had owned and into a one-bedroom rental near his office. We broke ground on the house in April. I designed it myself. I had drawn the first sketches the weekend after Margaret's memorial, and I had not stopped redrawing them since, a single story. Long and low, the main rooms facing the lake, a screened porch off the kitchen. 2 bedrooms because Eleanor said 2 was the right number. One for us and one for guests, and she did not want the other rooms a bigger house would have demanded. A garden on the south side for the dahlias she was going to move from the beds I had built her on Linden Street. Eleanor chose every window. I am not exaggerating. She sat with me at her kitchen table for 6 Sundays, and we went through the plan room by room, and she pointed at every opening on the elevations, and we talked about what would be on the other side of it, what light it would catch in the morning, what view she wanted to wake up to, and what view she wanted to wash dishes against. She had not designed a building in 30 years, but she remembered. She remembered everything. We had the framing up by the first week of May. The roof went on the week after. The wedding was scheduled for the second Saturday in June. We were not going to be moved in by then. We did not care. We had decided, somewhere along the way, that we were going to do the wedding on the property whether the house was finished or not. The night before the wedding, the house was a shell. The walls were up, the roof was on, the windows were in. There was no flooring, there were no doors yet, there was no kitchen. There was a great deal of sawdust and a tarp covering the open framing of what was going to be the front hall, and a porta-john behind the woodshed for the crew. Eleanor came out to the site at sundown. I had set up 2 camping chairs on the slab where the porch was going to be. I had brought a cooler with 2 beers and the leftovers from the rehearsal dinner her friends had thrown for her at Rose's house. I had brought 2 sleeping bags. I had brought a battery lantern. We ate the leftovers cold. We drank the beers. We talked. The way you talk when you have already said everything important and what is left is the small things, the things you say to fill the hours of being together. When it got fully dark, we zipped the 2 sleeping bags into one. We lay on the slab inside the open framing of what was going to be our living room. The roof was on, but there were no walls between us and the open framing. So the night sky was visible through the unfinished window openings on 3 sides of us, and the lake was a flat, dark plain through the front of the house. Eleanor fell asleep first. I stayed awake for a long time. I watched her face in the half moonlight coming through the framing. I thought about the patio in August, and the parking lot at Pepino's, and the back of the flower shop, and the gala and the shelf of land in the snow. I thought about Margaret. I thought about my mother. I thought about how much of a life can change in less than 2 years if a person stops listening to the wrong people for even a single evening. Then I slept too. Tomorrow we were getting married. The wedding was at 4 in the afternoon on the second Saturday of June. We had 31 guests. We had set up white folding chairs on the shelf of land where I had proposed, facing the lake. Rosa had done the flowers. There were dahlias from Eleanor's beds on Linden Street dug up that morning and arranged in mason jars along the aisle. There were lilies from the cooler at the shop. There was a small wooden arch at the front that I had built the weekend before from cedar offcuts left over from the framing of the house. Eleanor wore a cream-colored dress she had bought off the rack at a department store and had altered by a woman who had been her neighbor for 10 years. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. She wore her hair down. She carried 3 dahlias wrapped in a piece of twine because she had told me she did not want a bouquet that cost more than the food. William Pace gave her away. He had asked in May, in the careful way he asked everything, whether she might consider it, and she had cried for the first time in weeks, and she had said yes. He wore a gray suit, and he held her arm at the elbow as he walked her down the aisle, and when he handed her to me at the arch, he kissed her once on the temple and shook my hand and went and sat down beside my mother in the front row. My mother was there. She had come alone. She wore a navy dress, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not take her eyes off me through the entire ceremony. She had been sober 6 months by then, which is something I had not mentioned earlier in this story, because Eleanor and I had agreed it was not ours to tell, but I will tell you now because it matters. She had stopped drinking the morning after the dinner at Heller's, and she had not started again, and she had been seeing a counselor every Wednesday at 3. Cole was there. He sat at the back the way I had asked him to. He did not give a toast. He did not stand for photos. After the ceremony, he hugged Eleanor very carefully with his arms barely touching her, and he shook my hand and he told me he was happy for us, and I believed him. Marcus came. I will tell you about that. He did not come to the ceremony. He came to the end of it. He parked his car on the gravel road past the property line and walked the last quarter-mile up to the clearing. And he stood at the back, behind the last row of chairs, beside a tree, and he watched the vows. Our vows were short. Eleanor had written hers on the back of a flower shop receipt that morning because she had been trying to write them for a week and nothing had been right, and the receipt had been the thing in her hand when she finally said what she meant. I had written mine on the back of a Heller's napkin the night of the dinner, and I had carried it in my wallet for 3 months, and I had not changed a word of it. We said them out loud. The lake was behind us. The unfinished house was behind the lake, visible through the trees, a long low shape against the green. Eleanor cried a little when I said mine. I did not cry when she said hers, but I came close enough that I had to look at the lake for a moment before I could speak again. We kissed. The 31 people clapped. The string quartet, which had been 4 music students Rosa knew from the community college, started playing. Marcus turned around and walked back down the gravel road to his car. He did not come to the reception. He did not say anything to anyone. I watched him go, and I did not chase him, and I did not call him later that night. And that was the right decision then, and it is the right decision now. My father did not come. He did not send a card. He did not send anything. He had moved into a furnished apartment off Madison Avenue in April, and my mother had filed for separation in May, and the proceedings were still ongoing. I had not spoken to him since the night at Heller's. I have not spoken to him since. The reception was on the slab where the porch was going to be. We had strung lights between the framing posts. Rosa had made the food. My mother danced with me to a song she had picked out, which was something my grandmother used to sing in her kitchen, and which I had not heard in 20 years. Eleanor danced with William Pace, who turned out to be a surprisingly good dancer for a man in his 70s. The community college students played until midnight. We sent everyone home, and Eleanor and I slept on the slab again in the same double sleeping bag from the night before, because the house was still not finished and because we did not want to be anywhere else. We moved in 3 weeks later. I am writing this on the porch of the house I built on a Sunday morning in May, 2 years almost to the day from the night on the patio at the country club. The dahlias are blooming in the south garden. Eleanor's flower shop expanded last fall into the storefront next door, and Rosa retired in February and sold Eleanor the whole business for $1 and the promise to keep her name on the awning. My architecture practice opened its own office on Vernon Street, 3 doors down from Pepino's in November. I have 4 employees. We are working on a school. Eleanor is asleep against my shoulder right now. We are sitting on the porch swing I built her for her birthday last year. The lake is gray with morning. A heron is standing on our dock. We fostered Daniel and Mira last September. Daniel is 14 and Mira is 12. They are brother and sister. They had been in the system for 2 years when our caseworker called us. They have been with us 9 months. The adoption is going through in August. They have the second bedroom, and we converted the screened porch into a third when they moved in. Daniel is learning to draft on my old drafting board in the office. Mira works at the flower shop on Saturdays with Eleanor. I am holding Margaret's letter. I take it out and read it every year on the anniversary of the night we drove out here in the snow. The paper is getting soft at the folds. Eleanor keeps telling me to laminate it. I keep not doing it. I am thinking about my brothers right now, because I always do when I read the letter. Marcus is alone. He still lives in the city. He has not remarried. We have not spoken in 2 years. Devin's separation became a divorce in January. He sees his daughters every other weekend. He sent me a letter last fall, a real letter, 4 pages. I have not answered it yet. I think I will this summer. I am not sure. Cole is sober. He had not been sober in August of the year this story started, which I had not known then, and which explained a great deal of him. He calls me on Sunday nights. He came for Thanksgiving last year, and he brought a girlfriend who is his age and who is a kindergarten teacher and who Eleanor liked. My mother lives 10 minutes away. She has dinner with us on Wednesdays. She is teaching Mira to bake bread. She is slowly becoming the grandmother none of her sons ever gave her the chance to be. They set me up with a widow twice my age to embarrass me. They gave me my whole life instead.
If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to us, and it helps more people find videos like this one. See you in the next video.